Namaste and welcome to this exciting new show. And today we are going to debunk some important topics that that have affected our minds for a very long time. And I have a very important guest. And some of you may have read my article on Buddha's appearance. And we established that Buddha, according to us, our historians, came almost like 1300 years before the advent of Christ, and which I already disbelieve. I do not know whether it's true or not. But I have this gentleman who has done a lot of work, and he is a very renowned scholar from the Indian origin living in the US, and he has given many talks on this topic. So today let us discuss with him and hear from him what is the timelines conundrum, because that's a mystery which has been force fed to us after Gregory. And the Gregorian timelines, we all know that even in the English did not trust him. So let's see why the world should trust him if the English themselves did not trust him. So let us welcome Sri Raj Vedam.
Namaste, and thank you to all the listeners. Thank you, Aditya ji. A pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, first of all, I must congratulate you. You've done a very good, fabulous work in all this research that you have already collected.
Thank you.
And your last show was extremely popular. And from the US standards, US standards, you cross a couple of thousand. It looks very good.
Oh,
So,
very
today, first of all, I would like to give you the forum to tell us where is the timelines mismatch and why, or is there a reason behind it? Timelines mismatch.
So yes, it's one of the biggest problems because I think in any discussion we talk about frameworks. What are the frameworks that we use to study any phenomena? Because sometimes the questions that fall out of a discussion typically would be based on some framework. And as you rightly pointed out, we have been told here is a framework for Indian chronology, and this is the chronology that you should believe in. And unfortunately, we find instances where these chronologies do not match. And we are forced to ask these questions as researchers and as people who are just logical and rational, and asking, why is there a mismatch between the internal evidence of my people and the chronology you're telling me that we belong to? So rationally, one has got to examine both the claims made by Western chronologists as well as the claims made by the Indian chronologists and try to see where are the problems to understand these things. So I think in this discussion, what we can do is try and understand these frameworks. What are these frameworks? One of the early frameworks, like I said, now let's think of a triangle. In this triangle, you have the colonialists initially. Colonialists means the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the British, all of these Europeans who came to India at some point or the other, starting with trade, but very soon going on to conquest and colonial hegemony. So this is the first vertex of the triangle, if you will. They were accompanied on the other side of the triangle with the Christian imperialism. Christian imperialism followed wherever the colonialists went, and that's not a coincidence because they had an idea that the Pope at that time used to sanction these Catholic who used to go out on these voyages, saying any land you go to, you can claim for Christendom. And therefore, the Spaniards went and claimed all of America for that. Portuguese came and tried to do that in India, and so on and so forth. So Christian imperialism was a part of the Western colonial movement. Then finally, on the third side, you have the so-called colonial academic frameworks where people brought in ideas like racial theories. They brought in anthropology, they brought in Eurocentric ideas, they brought in frameworks of caste, and all these things to try and understand the Indian framework. So we have this triangle that I talked about, colonialists, Christian imperialists, and the academics of that time who were part of this framework. They were not outside the framework to bring an independent line of thinking. They were Christians who were colonialists, therefore, they all inherited certain common ideas. So, the earliest thinking of these people were that God created the world in 4004 BCE. So it is today we look back and say, what a ridiculous notion. However, in those days, that was a dominant thinking of the Anglican Church. Any educated Englishman or a European coming would believe from the reckoning of the chronologies of the prophets in the Old Testament that the world was created in 4004 BCE. They also believed the biblical account that God destroyed the world in 3000 BCE in Noah's flood. And so their idea and worldview was that there cannot be a history prior to this Masonic account. There's got to be a flood. There's got to be all these things. And so you cannot have. So if they encountered, and they did encounter an Indian framework, that there were instances that were older than the flood event, the question comes, is a biblical record wrong or is the Indian chronology wrong? And so we come to the first point where we try to evaluate what is going on over here. So we look at the writings of early colonialists like William Jones or like Max Muller. We see in their own writings that they have declared they believe the accounts of the Genesis to be factual and historical. This is what William Jones has said in a certain book and publication. I talk about it in my talks. He brings out that point. Similarly, Max Muller also believed the biblical account of history. He wrote a letter to his wife saying that I believe if we show the Indians root of the religion and all that has sprung from it, that's the easiest way to dismantle that religion. So they were motivated by two things. One is the colonialists wanted to uphold their scholarship of biblical chronology. So they brought in those frameworks. Their foot soldiers were the Christian missionaries who came along and who wanted to also to try and uphold the biblical ideas. So they came with their own chronological ideas. Then finally, this Eurocentrism, this question of asking, who are we as a European people? We meaning the colonialists would ask that. When they found commonality of Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek, especially William Jones, when he found these languages were related, the Europeans wanted to know who are they as a people. And to address that question, they use the mechanism of linguistics to address that. So this mishmash of these three ideas gave rise to the earliest frameworks with which Indian chronology was studied. So initially, the British came and said, where does Indian history begin? Where does it end? Because when I read the Puranas, there is no hint of the Greeks or the Babylonians or
Nowhere.
the Egyptians, which they were familiar with.
Yeah.
And they're asking, where does it begin? Where does it end? No idea. So,
Let me interject you a little bit. So
yes.
when Vyasdev in Mahabharata, because for me, Mahabharata, Ramayana, and Veda, they are the axiomatic truth,
Hmm.
and I want them to refute it because I want to present our version of it.
Right,
So just like you're also doing the same thing. So when Vyasdev says in Mahabharata, any history that doesn't begin in Mahabharata is fake news, is a lie.
right. Hmm.
So these are all connect. They have disconnected themselves from the timelines of Mahabharata. Won't it be
Right,
all considered a fake news now for rest of the Indians or Vedic culture? So anyone who connects with that history or seeks validation from that history or timelines, for us as Sanatana Dharma followers, it's a fake news.
right. Right. So it's a very, very interesting point that you make over there that the kind of timelines that Vedavyasa has put over there and is proposing, and the new evidence coming out in various areas like genetics and populations in various parts of the world and everything leads us to believe that these huge events like war or the reduction in the number of males around the world in a certain time frame and the various geological phenomena, all these things make us sit back and question that why is it that we are not able to map our timelines to some of the notions that Vedavyas has put there in Mahabharata, as well as the evidence that is coming out. However, going back to our earlier story of the timelines, we know found that, and they found that phonetically it matches Chandragupta Maurya. The problem is that Chandragupta Maurya is 1200 years earlier than 300 BCE. He should be
Absolutely.
dated around 1500 BCE, according to the Indian Puranic accounts. Similarly, Gautama Buddha, like you pointed out, is 1800 BCE. This is almost 3800 years before from now, and not in the time frame they're putting him. So clearly, if one were to accept the Puranic time accounts, there are some issues. And we as Indians need to ask the question. We have internal sources like many of the Puranas, Matsya Purana, Brahmanda Purana, Vayu Purana. All these Puranas have got several sections. The first section talks about cosmology. How did the world come into existence? It talks about its ideas about creation and other things. Second section of Puranas might talk about stories of divinities. Third section talks about chronology of kings, of the divinities and kings, ranging all the way from Manu, going downwards up to Mahabharata period, going downwards all the way down to the Gupta Empire. So we have got chronology lists that are there in various Puranic accounts, and they have got internal correspondence between each other. So the
Absolutely.
question we must ask is, are we going to discard this because somebody phonetically found that Chandragupta Maurya is the same as Sandrakutas? So you see what I'm saying. So chronologically, we have a big problem when we try and say this phonetic account is what we should map on ourselves. Then we ask a question: does it mean my Puranic accounts are all unreliable? That is indeed the position that the Westerners took. The Westerners took the position that Puranic timelines are unreliable or cannot be used because there was a lot of intellectual thinking around that time. I think Parjitar and a whole lot of other people who were trying to talk about Puranic timelines, about mismatches from one Purana to the other. One king was up here, one king is down here. So this kind of analysis led them, rather than along a path of intellectual discovery, they wanted to cherry pick the notion they wanted, that here is the account timeline that we want, reduce chronology, and we need to cherry pick king lists from the Puranics. So we'll cherry pick by saying these guys are all fictitious kings. We'll move these kings from this timeline down here. These are all, I don't believe them, and here Chandragupta Maurya is linked with this. So this is the development which led to the kind of timelines that we see today. And like you rightly posed the question early, we need to challenge these things. The challenging comes not only with the Puranic timelines, the discussion must be expanded to the frameworks of genetics, the frameworks of astronomy, the frameworks of geology. All of these things have got data points that support the chronology that we are talking about and goes against the chronology derived from linguistics and other such ideas.
Very good point you made. There
Hmm.
is since you quoted Purana, I'll quote you Bhagavad Purana, which is
Hmm.
the written by Vyasa again under the instruction of Narada. So
Hmm.
Narada has validated those dates also.
Hmm.
It says very clearly that Nanda came 1150 years after Krishna left the planet.
Hmm.
And after that, and Nanda's ruled for 100 years. After that, the Maurya, Chandragupta Maurya became the king with Chanakya. Chanakya's name is especially mentioned there.
Hmm.
Chanakya made Chandragupta Maurya. They ruled for 137 years. So
Right.
when Chandragupta Maurya appeared, that time Buddhism was not there.
Right.
And his son was Ashok, his grandson, his son was Bindusar, and then the grandson was Ashok. And that Ashok is different than the Ashok which we see with, later on with Gautam Buddha. Because this
Hmm.
Buddha was Anjaneya Sutta, and he's considered a is Vishnu incarnation. And he's a very different than the later Buddha that we see who attained enlightenment. So
Hmm.
he attained, Vishnu doesn't attain enlightenment. Vishnu comes enlightened. So there is no
Right.
mention of Gautama or Siddhartha attaining enlightenment because Vishnu is come as Buddha. It is mentioned in Kali Yuga, the first incarnation in Kali Yuga is Buddha.
Right.
So, so this exactly puts into doubt. So the Chandragupta Maurya ruled for around 35 years. After that, his son took over, and when his son took over, only thing which was famous was at that time was Rishabh's followers, Lord Rishabh's followers. Rishabh is a Vishnu avatar, and his followers were called
Hmm.
Jains. and they were the only people famous
Hmm.
there. So Buddhism was not there until 50 years back, 50 years after he came. So if you can safely say that 1150 plus 35 years. So it becomes
Hmm.
1000 uh, 80 something 85, 1185 years or
Right.
89 years
Hmm.
after Krishna disappeared. So,
Hmm.
which is before, if you subtract it by 5122 today, you get the exact number what when Buddha came. So, I can come to the
Right.
margin of error of 10 to 15 years in which we can say Buddha
Right.
came at that time. Now, if Buddha's
Very.
timeline changed, then everything else changes now. So,
Yes.
so this is the this dichotomy right there, and since many viewers are watching now, I can say that this is what we have to question, because this puts everything, this removes the doubts and confusions over the Vedic date. And now we have to
Yes.
question why the Western influence or why the Western universities are talking such a garbage on timelines.
Very true. Very true. So, like I said, these triangle that I talked about, those frameworks were the ones that colonial Indology first came about. And pretty soon, once the British were going on their colonialization drive throughout Asia, they also found this northern Iraq. They found the Mitannis and the Hittites, and around 1880 and so on. And their goal was to try and explain how come there are Vedic people living in northern Iraq, so far away from India, and is it possible through linguistics to try and talk about migrations? So the whole question went to one of migrations, and they tried to say where is the homeland for the Proto-Indo-European language speakers. So they postulated that all the languages in Europe and in northern India are related as so-called Indo-European language systems, and they had an ancestral language. Their ancestral language is PIE, Proto-Indo-European, and the quest was to try and say, where is the PIE homeland? Eventually, the scholarship said that it's got to be between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. That is the area where the ancestral speaker was. And these people, they postulated, had domesticated the wild horse. Once they domesticated the wild horse in 3000 BCE, and once they had discovered iron and making of sword, they said in three waves, these people from Central Asia colonized the world. So this was the theories which until around crystallizing and articulated by Maria Gimbutas's 1950s, the Kurgan hypothesis, the so-called idea that Yamnaya people migrated from Central Asia in three waves, 3000 BC up to 1500 BCE, and colonized that part of Europe, becoming the beakerware people, the cordedware people, Vincha culture in Ukraine, and all of those things, and this side becoming Andronovo people, the Tokharians, and the later on the so-called Aryans who came into India in that time frame. This is what led to their notion of Aryan invasion theory. And they found also in that time frame the Harappan civilization. They found evidence of that late 1800s, excavated in 1900s by John Marshall and others. So they found evidence of a culture living there, and Mechar Harappa was traced back to 2600 BCE. So their story became that the so-called Aryans came from Central Asia on horseback and chariots, invaded the peaceful Harappa people, replaced them. Harappa people went to south, became the Dravidians, and these people colonized the northern plains and became the so-called Aryan people, bringing in the Sanskrit language, the Vedic religion, and all of these things. So between 1500 BCE to 200 BCE, Max Muller proposed that all of the books and the corpus of rich works of Hindu texts were all written in this time frame. Whether it was the Chandas period, Mantra period, Sutra period, and so on, all the books were written in this time frame. This is his proposal. And so, according to them, it is a pastoral, non-urban people, they hesitate to use the word civilization, who came in with these kind of concepts. And we had to wait until 300 BCE before Patliputra started showing civilization again after contact with the Greeks. So this is the story that has been told to us. Again, how do we even address the story? We address the story by looking at its assumptions. The first assumption, you talked about somebody called Aryans, you meaning the colonialists. Who are the Aryans? Arya has been a word that is used in India in the context of a noble person. So when you say there is a people called Aryan, who are they? And we need to understand that. Are they a race? Are they a language? Are they some kind of skin color? Or what exactly is Aryan? We have no idea, right? Because in India, we use the word Arya for noble qualities. If you expound noble dharmic qualities, then you're Arya. If you have not noble, ignoble ideas, like Dushasana, for example, Dushasana, who is he? He disrobed Draupadi, right, in the court in front of everybody. So he's an Anarya, opposite of Aryan, Anarya, because he disrobed Draupadi. We never said that these are all Aryans and those are all Dravidians. Such a word has never been used in the Indian context for the longest time. So we challenge it second by looking at the whole body of literature in India over thousands of years, whether it is Vedic literature, whether it is Brahmana, Samhitas, or Puranas, or whatever you take, whether you go to northern part of India, whether you go to Sangam literature, excuse me, southern part of India, eastern India, northern India, not one region is talking about India as two people. It is not saying those guys in the south, they do that, whereas we in the north, we do these things. They don't talk that. When they talked about the whole of Aryabharta, they talked about a region geography that encompasses a lot of regions in all of India, including the triangular part of India. Nobody in the consciousness of the writing, whether it is Aryabhatta, whether it is Vyasa, whether it is Valmiki, whether it is Bhaskara, from any period of time you take, they never said Aryan Dravidian. However, the minute the British came to India, they used this word Aryan, and the missionaries, Robert Caldwell, he introduced the word Dravidian for the southern Indian. And all of a sudden today, everybody's mapping their ideologies as Aryans and Dravidians. Don't we find it to be very, very strange? Thousands of years, hundreds and thousands of Indian works, not one author is talking about invasion, not one author is talking about oppression, not one author has talked about we are two separate people. But 200 years, such an idea has been put into us, and we are mapping these frameworks today. So this is why I said the frameworks are very important. What are the frameworks with which they come and tell us these things? How do we challenge these frameworks by understanding the assumptions on which they were built? Then looking for evidence today where these frameworks can be challenged. So I'm trying to do that using the tools of astronomy, tools of genetics, tools of geology and other things. And there is enough of evidence out there, Aditya ji, where we can talk about many of these frameworks.
No, you put very important point and important discussion here for many of the viewers to see. Now, first of all, for people who are watching us live right now, my question to them is that we clearly, as a on a Sattology platform, and together me and Raj, we clearly feel that there is a wrong history being taught to the Western students, including Indian students also, wrong history being taught. So my first question is that can we check that why the Gregorian calendar history is imposed, first of all, or whether that Gregorian calendar itself a valid calendar or not. Is there a scientific basis behind those calendars? Because just imposing a timeline on somebody else's history without proof is a criminal act in one way to remove the identity, and also it's a very uncivilized act, and which we already know that English had no connection to any civility in the entire history. And even the Vatican Church, in many ways, we all know, as a history students, we know that their history has been fudged. The Pope, the seat of Pope of Rome has been the most widely contested seat because it gave the power, and the condescending attitude towards other cultures, and has led back to the situation today where I commonly say, when you point one finger at others, then three point at you and one to God. So the entire history of Pope is the Vatican is
Correct.
that history today, where the God is itself questioning whether Vatican is relevant or not, and Vatican themselves are questioning three times over whether they are relevant or not, or truthful or not. Now, having made that statement, Raj, what is needed? Like you let out some methodology also, but what more can we do as a group, at least as students, because universities don't give any freedom, no academic
Mm,
freedom. There is a
mm,
curriculum, you study that curriculum,
mm,
then you do pass,
mm.
and then they give you the research topics. It's like very
Right,
vicious cycle. So most of the
right,
people, even if they understand it, they can't do anything about it.
right, right. So very good questions. Very good questions. So I'll start with the earlier premise you started, and then I'll go take up this issue. So the first premise is the calendar systems. The first thing they noticed was that, like you first, let me go a little more back. You correctly pointed out that the imperialistic ideas with which Christianity and Eurocentrism, a toxic mix, the way it was imposed on the world is that an experience is not relevant unless validated by a Western presence and the church's presence. If the church and the West did not articulate that experience, it does not exist. It is immaterial. It is bogus. It is pagan. You see, all these kind of notions have come out of this Western universalism that Rajiv Malhotra ji has articulated so well, those things. And we find that to be true again and again. And one of these ideas of imperialism, I said that when the Pope, he said that any of these sailors, they get out and discover new lands, go and put a flag there and say, take it for Christendom. He gave them a blank check saying, anywhere you go. So the land, even if Indians were living there, even if Native Americans were living there for thousands of years, it does not matter. You don't matter. Your history doesn't matter. Nothing matters. What matters is now I have made my presence over here. Your history now begins in the context of who I am and how I choose to see your history. So this is the way they have imposed their frameworks. And the same thing goes to India too. For example, look at the absurdity of this. We have got the names of the nakshatras for so long. For example, the a very visible star at this time of the year is the star that we call Jeshta. Jeshta is elder. That's a nakshatra. In the Greek tradition, it's called Antares. So they choose to call it by a Western traditional name, though the Indian name is much older. Same thing going to Chitra, which is or Spika and or Swati, and so on and so forth. The question comes that although there is documented evidence of people in the Indian context using these frameworks for a long time, it does not matter to the West. What does matter is they came and they put their stamp and they said, this is what it is. Same thing goes for calendars that you said some time back. So the calendars were really an attempt to mark time, and the time of Julius Caesar, they adopted the solar calendar of 365.25 days, adding a leap year every fourth year and so on. And they noticed that their holidays were slipping. Over a course of 1,000 years, holidays were slipping because of the precession of equinox phenomenon. The precession of equinox, remember last time I said, it's a 26,000 year cycle that the Earth is doing, where the axis of rotation is tracing a path in the sky. It is going from the Druptara star that we have right now all the way to Abhijit. Abhijit is a star called Vega. So from Druptara, which is Polaris, Earth is going on a huge rotation going to Abhijit in the other extreme and coming back to Polaris. So this cycle takes 26,000 years. Because of the cycle, where the solstices and where the equinox happens, our Shankarantis, they keep changing over a course of hundreds and thousands of years. The day on which it happens changes because of this phenomenon. So when the Julius Caesar adopted the Julian calendar, they noticed that holidays had slipped for the Christian experience by many tens of days, whereas in the Indian context it was never an issue because we used our nakshatra model. We use a nakshatra model and we had a perfect understanding of the skies for tens of thousands of years. Our festivals never slipped because our astronomers knew the calculations needed to get these things. So by the time it came to Gregory, like you pointed out, they had already understood a lot of astronomy from the Indians. Remember, Indian astronomy went to the Arabs in the 7th century, 9th century. From there, it was injected into Spain, Muslim Spain as well as India. Arabic text, Sanskrit text, translated to Arabic, translated to Latin in Toledo, in Spain, and then injected into rest of Western Europe. So the Western Europe gradually got its knowledge. And by the time they also adopted the Hindu numerals, they were able to do decimal place value systems rather than using Latin numerals and Roman numerals for doing their work. These things coincided with their society asking these relevant questions. Can we introduce a better calendar system where the holidays do not slip? And thereby the Gregorian calendar was born, where they also chopped out, I think, about 21 days or something to synchronize between where the holidays were and where the Julian calendar was. So this is their frameworks. And so everything exists now because this is the calendar imposed on the world. So no longer do we use our traditional calendars to call out the day. You and I still use the Gregorian calendar to mark time and so on. The second part of your question. Last part you asked, what can people do today? The fact that we know these things, but we feel helpless to change. So many things, we can do many things. One is we as Hindus are enjoined to go on a path of knowledge and
Even
discovery.
American students, many American students are also watching. They're
Okay,
also the same view.
thank you for that alert, Aditya ji. So even among the Americans, it is the same in the spirit of rationality, in the spirit of inquiry and discovery. One needs to go and look at where are the claims and frameworks that were imposed to study world chronology, world history, and so on, and where is the evidence coming from other angles using which we can question some of these frameworks. So if that's a first point for yourself, trying to understand that. If there are educators watching this, the question comes, how can you enhance the content taught in your classrooms so that you can expose your students to this other scientific literature coming elsewhere? So if you study in one side, let's say Aryan invasion theory, the very next page must have a box, critical thinking for the student, that asks, do you know that today there are people challenging these earlier colonial frameworks on the basis of the following? So allow the students a chance to ramp up on critical thinking. Then the third level of engagement is if you have contacts with educational authorities, like for example in Texas, it is Texas Education Agency. In California, they got their own boards and so on. Try to introduce this curriculum, which is what I'm trying to do with working with other groups and so on. So this happens. And the fourth level of engagement is if you're an educator itself, try to develop contents where you can offer short-term courses that expose the interested person to this different chronology that is different from the traditional frameworks imposed on them. So these are the 4 or 5 things we could do to use this information going forward.
Absolutely. Also, I think when you talk about astronomy, the world view of astronomy of planets revolving around the sun itself needs to be questioned because it doesn't match with the Bhagavad Puran's version. Now, it's a bombshell. I know I'm throwing it out, but we will discuss it at one more time where we say the Vedic cosmology. In fact, many temples are coming up in the world. We are trying to show the cosmology of the Bhagavad, and in that cosmology, the entire time frame, everything else also changes. Because when we have two objects revolving, then it may automatically appear that one is following the other. So you can even say whether the sun is following it or the moon is following it. But there is a very famous quote, and you must be well aware of that. In Vedas, it is mentioned Arunodaya, that Suryadev sits on his chariot, and Arun is the charioteer, his brother, younger brother, who is actually like he is not a Viklang. Viklang he is like is a
Mhm.
disabled or differently able person, and he is walking on a yoke, and his he's stuck on the Meru Parvat, and they're running circle like in a circular way, and there
Mhm.
is a path laid out, which is a very common prayer also in there.
Mhm.
So we will touch upon that a little later on. But the if we study that model, then I think the accuracy of time calculation and the period calculation becomes much more clearer. And then we know the viewpoint that how the our ancient sages have calculated the ages and where they come so accurate. They're so confident that they have mentioned all the 37 kings, 40 kings, 10 kings, 11 kings. I mean, somebody cannot be so confident and write the names also of those. And many of those names, like Shunga dynasty. Shunga dynasty is a well-known
mm,
dynasty which came right after the
right.
Maurya, and they were known to bring Vaishnavism, or the Shankaracharya is in the Shunga dynasty. So Shankaracharya was
Mm,
appeared in Shunga dynasty, which is right after the Chandragupta Maurya period, which exactly fits into the timelines of the Puranic timelines, where Chandragupta, after right in the middle of the Maurya period, came Buddha. He stopped animal
mm,
killing, and then Adi
mm,
Shankaracharya came, introduced back the Vedic principles, and right after that is Ramanujacharya, which in the after post Gupta period, in Purana is called Vishwas Purji,
mm,
and then he introduced the Raman pure Dvaita philosophy. So from the Puranic point of view, it makes sense to you and me, but the Western timelines, they have completely superimposed their colonial to prove their superiority and to prove. Actually, I see very insecurity of the church, where they are trying to find their own identity because they have so much lied to the people. So to cover up one lie, they have to create another lie and
mm.
another lie, another lie. Even the Gospel of Saint Peter's was hidden, where it was a lot of exposition was there. The Gospel of Thomas was hidden, because you all know that the history, and people don't know Saint Peter's Church, the Peter's Basilica. It is was there. Nero, the circus owner, had held Peter upside down and crucified him at the same spot. And if people know this brutality of the church and the fudging with the timelines, I do not know when will people will question them in spite of blindly studying them and believing it. I know for earning money it's important, but not for any other purpose. So last comment from you, and then we'll end up this session. And again, we'll come back with a cosmology discussion later on. Please go ahead.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you for that comment over there, Aditya ji. So yes, there's a lot to talk about Puranas, about the cosmology that is presented in Puranas. A naive reading of the Puranas will have us dismissing those accounts as mythology, fantastical accounts, impossible supernatural events, and so on. However, in my recent works, I've tried to show that if you were to look for the metaphors used by Vedavyasa and other writers, you'll understand that they were trying to encapsulate certain phenomena in, I call it infotainment capsules, where you meld in observational wisdom or a moral wisdom or any other wisdom into a story. And the story encapsulates what the message of that particular episode is. So we have today a situation where when we are confronted with a Puranic story or we're confronted with some aspect from the scriptures, if we have the key to unlock that wisdom, it makes sense to us. Normally, the key is provided by a guru. A guru who has spent a lot of years of studying the scriptures and has got some inner wisdom and has understood it. He is able to tell us this is the key. If you use this metaphor and this mapping, you see this is what the story is trying to tell you. So we understand that. If you don't have that key, then, like I said, it becomes a trivial reading of these things as a mythology. So I have repeatedly found on cosmology several startling things in the context of modern science. If we talk about science and we talk about our understanding of cosmology, we find these accounts in Bhagavad Purana, Srimad Bhagavatam. We find these accounts elsewhere. And the question comes, how did our ancients know these things? Did they have the luxury of today's technological implements and labs to do these things? Well, I say the same thing what scientists did. Today's scientists, what do we do? If there is a difficult problem that we are working on, we think about it. We sit and think about it. We write it on the whiteboard. We talk to our colleagues. Discussions, understanding, perception. After maybe days and weeks, suddenly we get a flash of intuition and say, aha, that's what it's all about. And then I capture that phenomena in mathematical equations and we studied it. Our rishis were not very different. They too went to secluded places in the forest or caves or other places, and they went into meditative states. They tried to understand important questions on creation, existence, purpose of life, and all of these things. And they too had flashes of intuition, inner understanding, and so on. and they sought to capture their understandings in the metaphor of stories that people would understand. And so, if we take this view and we can interpret several of the Puranic stories in this context, we see the correspondence between where science is taking us and where the Puranas are taking us. So, I thought I'll end on that note, Aditya ji, because you brought up this issue. So, there's a lot of interesting science encoded in the Indian texts. One needs to understand the metaphor. If the metaphor is clear, we understand what the story is.
Excellent. And viewers, you heard this exciting discussion between with Sri Raj Vedam, and I asked him some questions, and you can see his expertise there. And so viewers, keep watching. And next time we're going to come with more exciting content on what Raj said ended his answer with. And we'll talk about all these different aspects in detail. And also you'll hear many of the speakers. So keep watching Sattology, and also thank you for allowing us into your campus.
Thank you. Namaste. Thank you very much, listeners.